For the first time ever in the history of One Piece, we have learned a massive fact about the forbidden history of the Void Century and the true identity of the legendary Joy Boy. And of course, this is all thanks to Vegapunk's shocking message from chapter 1114, where he finally confirmed the mind-blowing fact that Joy Boy and the sun god Nika are not the same person. And while many people have speculated that they were separate characters to begin with, I was kind of expecting that, to be honest, as well. But now that we basically know that for sure, we can take everything that we know and analyze both of these two enormously important figures for the story of One Piece. Because first off, Vegapunk says that Joy Boy fought with the same stretchy body as the legendary sun god Nika from the fables of Elbaf, which basically confirms what we already knew, that Joy Boy had the same Nika powers that Luffy now possesses as well. But what is really new from this information is that it appears that the sun god Nika was already a legendary figure from the past, even before Joy Boy's time during the Void Century. And so very much just like Luffy, Joy Boy inherited Nika's powers instead of being the original source of them. Also, in case you're wondering, there is a festival going on outside my window, so in case you hear any bagpipes, that's that, not on me. Now, we don't know if Joy Boy got these powers from a devil fruit or from some other method, but this information essentially disproves one really big community theory we've had for a while, and that is that Joy Boy put his own soul and will into a devil fruit so he could pass on his powers into the future. This was actually a very popular idea around that time that Luffy first awakened his own devil fruit in Wano, but clearly that is not the case anymore, since we have basically now confirmation that Joy Boy used the very same powers as Nika had in the past. So that's already one very popular fan theory disproved right out the gate, but what's even more shocking is that if Nika was a legendary figure that actually existed even before Joy Boy, that gives us a huge hint about what the world was actually like in the extremely distant past, even before the Void Century. Because one thing that we do know about Nika is that he is a mythological savior of slaves. And so if the original Nika was not from the Void Century, but way before then, that also means that Nika was needed to save slaves from even further back in time. And what that basically means is that the world was not just a great and happy place even in the past. In fact, the fact that Joy Boy and Nika are two different saviors from two different eras leads me to believe that the history of the world has basically gone in big cycles, much like our real worlds. And this cycle probably goes something like this. The world starts out free, but eventually one person or a group of people takes control of the entire world and starts enslaving other people. Then, after many years of this enslaved and tormented state, a savior rises up to free the world from its oppressive rulers. This then of course leads to another period of freedom, and if this has happened multiple times throughout history, then it does make sense that the Nika myth would be present in many cultures around the world, especially if the savior has had very similar powers each single time. Now, of course, that is somewhat speculation, so let's get back to some facts here that we do know about legendary Nika. Because for one, the strongest connection we do have between Nika and our current characters comes from the race of the Giants. In fact, Nika has been linked to the Giants of Elbaf multiple times just in this arc alone. For example, also in chapter 1114, Vegapunk tells us that Nika is a legend of worship in Elbaf, but even back in chapter 1106, the giant captains Dory and Broggy specifically pointed out that Luffy's Gear 5th powers do resemble that of the legendary sun god Nika. In other words, it's very obvious that Nika is such an important figure to the Giants that even his powers and his appearance are very clearly described and very well known. But that's of course not the only connection that we have, because if you remember back to Big Mom's flashback, we learned that the Giants have a celebration called the winter solstice. How this basically works is that the Giants give thanks to the sun by eating a bunch of food, very Luffy style, and then they fast for 12 days, then they break their fast by having another giant feast, and again, giving thanks to the sun. Which, if you look at it really closely, this celebration might very well be foreshadowing and a near perfect representation for the cycles of the One Piece world's history. For example, the world starts out out in a period of peace and prosperity, then there are many dark days of struggle, and then at the end they come out of the dark times by feasting and thanking the sun. And if that process doesn't sound familiar to you, then I think you haven't really been paying close attention to like the entire story of One Piece, because this basically happens also in every single One Piece arc. The Straw Hats arrive at some new and exciting location, then they start learning the dark secrets and go through a period of real struggle before they finally defeat the ultimate villain of the arc and finally also celebrate with a big feast. In fact, some arcs even go so far as to match the end of the arc with the rising sun. And of course, at this point, we do know that Nika does represent the sun, so it makes a lot of sense that the true purpose of the winter solstice is a celebration of Nika saving the giants from some past period of intense darkness. Regardless though, the reason I say all this is to really nail home the point that Nika is a figure who has most likely shown up many times throughout history, and Luffy or even Joy Boy were just the latest version who will save the world. But what's truly exciting here though is that apparently Nika doesn't always win, because clearly Joy Boy didn't win because he wasn't able to keep his promise to the fishermen, for example. He did fail to bring them to the surface, and on top of that, the world was forced to live under the rule of the New World government and its secret ruler, Emu. But now that we've talked a lot about Nika, let's dive more into Joy Boy, because there are layers to what we just learned about him just from this chapter that you may not have even realized. Okay, so on the surface, we had the stunning reveal from Vegapunk that Joy Boy was the first pirate who ever set out to sea, which is just an insane statement. Like, what does that even mean? You might be wondering how that is even possible, because surely there were some type of people before him that also sailed on the ocean, right? Well, it's not that simple. You see, to really understand this, we have to think about the world right before the Void Century. As we've discussed in this video about chapter 1113, there is pretty strong evidence to suggest that the One Piece world was not always covered with water as it is right now, but that at one time it experienced a major cataclysmic flood. And so if Joy Boy really was the first pirate, maybe that means that he was the very first person to set out on the new oceans after the worldwide flood, which I think is a real strong possibility. But there is actually one other option out there as well, because in One Piece, the sea represents many things. For most people, it's a very dangerous obstacle that separates their islands from the rest of the world. But it is even more dangerous for devil fruit users, because the sea literally hates them and will leave them unable to move if they fall in, basically letting them drown if no one saves them. In other words, it's very possible that the world before the Void Century just straight up made it illegal for people to even sail on the seas because of the dangers that it represented to the people. Which then again could explain why Joy Boy was actually the very first pirate, if he was the first to break this rule and set out to explore the oceans. And to add even more to this idea, we do know that Luffy's definition of being a pirate is all about freedom and adventure. So by calling Joy Boy the first pirate, it is very possible that Joy Boy was the first to really represent the spirit of freedom and adventure that Luffy has always shown us time and time again. And there's even one more possibility, which is maybe my favorite one, which takes us all the way up to the moon. Because if you look back through Enel's cover story, we can clearly see a civilization once existed on the moon, thriving there. And in fact, many people do think that this is the highly advanced civilization that is mentioned in the past. So what if Joy Boy became the very first pirate just by leaving the Moon Kingdom and traveling down to the Blue Planet? I mean, that would certainly fit with the idea of Joy Boy making friends with races all around the world, and could even explain why the Moon civilization fell into ruin after Joy Boy and his Nika powers left the moon. That being because Nika's drums of liberation type heartbeat does seem to be capable of powering the ancient technology like the robot, the so-called Eternal Flame, which we also will have to discuss more in just a few moments. However, Joy Boy's title as the very first pirate also brings up some very confusing questions as well, because For the longest time, we have figured that Joy Boy was the leader of the Ancient Kingdom. And during the Egghead Island arc, we had also confirmed that the ancient past was technologically advanced, so many of us logically just assumed that Joy Boy was the leader of this high-tech society. However, Vegapunk very clearly states here that Joy Boy was born into an advanced society, so the technology already existed way before he was ever born, and he also appeared to leave that society behind in order to become a pirate. And so really all of this leads to the super interesting question: did Joy Boy form the Ancient Kingdom after he left the other advanced civilization? Or maybe he was just the leader of the high-tech society and then he gave up that title to become a pirate? And could Joy Boy's adventures, where he befriended many different races throughout the One Piece world, have caused the eventual war that led to the Void Century, kind of having the Ancient Kingdom be the bad guys here? And honestly, I cannot wait to find out the answers to all these questions, but there is one other piece of evidence that I want to point out about the timing of Joy Boy becoming a pirate and the eventual war with the other 20 kingdoms. Because you might remember that back in chapter 965, back during Wano, we learned that Amatsuki Toki, the wife of Kozuki Oden, had a very interesting childhood. According to Toki, her parents were from Wano, but she actually does not know where she was born to begin with. Now, to me, that hints at the fact that she was probably born on a ship which was sailing around the world, and if that is the case, then it would likely have to be after Joy Boy became the first pirate. We also know that Toki fled her own timeline, hoping to reach the time of the next Joy Boy, which again hints that she was born into a time of war. And so I think it's very likely that setting out to sea was either one of the major causes or results of the Void Century War to begin with. If we're talking about sources of conflict though, there is probably no more important resource in the world right now than the Mother Flame that was finally revealed for the very first time in this chapter as well. And wow, call me crazy, but I did not expect it somehow to be a literal flame, let alone a small ball of fire inside a tank of some sort of liquid. Like, how is that even possible? And what is that liquid? Is it water? Is it some sort of other gas or solution? Like, I'm not sure, but I have so many questions, and that single panel alone of the giant tank has so many hidden details and clues in it, I can't even begin. But first, let's talk about the flame itself. Based on what we've been told previously, this Mother Flame is an imitation of the Eternal Flame that used to power the entire ancient civilization. And honestly, call me crazy, but just looking at the whole tank itself, it kind of reminds me a little bit of a nuclear power plant. I mean, in case you didn't know, nuclear power plants use heat from nuclear fission to boil water, which creates steam, and that pressurized steam is then used to spin giant mechanisms that produce energy via induction. And honestly, that could just be exactly what we're seeing right here with the Mother Flame boiling the water that then produces energy. Now, we don't know what that energy is currently being used for, but we do know that it is needed to power some type of super weapon that Ima possesses. But next, let's actually look at the actual flame itself here, because there is no real clue on how this flame is able to burn inside the liquids. Is it some sort of magical flame or some scientific source or heat? Like, we really have no idea, but Oda could have drawn inspiration from the ancient Greeks, who were known to have their own special flames that could burn on water. That's a real thing. However, sadly, the process to create these magic Greek flames was actually lost to history, not unlike what happened to the ancient kingdom's power source as well. But as we're looking at the flame here, it kind of also reminds me of the way that souls are shown in One Piece as well. For example, look at Brook's soul right here. And while it's not exactly the same, yeah, it is still entirely possible that the Mother Flame we see here has some type of connection to souls in the One Piece world. Especially because it seems to be alive in some sort of way as well. I mean, just look at the panel above the giant robot. Here we do see the flame seems to swell larger and larger in response to something. Now, it could be that it is reacting to Luffy's Gear 5th transformation, the Iron Giant robot, or maybe even Saint Saturn destroying things throughout the room. And in fact, I think this last option here does seem kind of likely given the fact that Saturn seems to react to the flame itself as well. First, he has to shield himself somewhat from seeing it, and then we also see him turn back into his human form. And I'm really curious here, honestly, if he transformed back into a human because of the mother flame or because he just felt like being in a smaller size. I'm really not sure, but it could just be that the mother flame itself has some sort of negative effect on the demonic Gorosei or devil fruit users. However, that's of course far from the only interesting thing that we can get in this panel, because you may have noticed the weird markings for S108 and A and Mu on the giant tank as well. And while it isn't immediately apparent what those mean, I did do a little bit of digging with my team and found some really interesting connections. Let's start with the numbers, because the number 108 has in fact many really important religious and mathematical meanings. This is like an entire rabbit hole you can dive in, but just a few quick examples. The number 108 is the number of earthly temptations in Buddhism, and some temples in Japan will ring a bell 108 times at the end of the year to ward off the temptations of the new year. In Hinduism, there are 108 deities, and there are also 108 connections between the chakras in your own body. In fact, many religions take the number 108 to be fundamental to the creation of the world and sacred geometry, with the number 1 representing the divine, the number 0 representing the void, and the number 8 representing infinity. And talking about sacred geometry, the number also plays an important role in our own planets and the sun. For example, at certain times of the year, the Earth and the moon are separated by a distance of 108 moons. Same thing with the sun. Earth and the sun are at some point separated by a distance of 108 suns. And there are many more examples with this number, but just know that 108 is a very important number related to the very existence of the world itself that has shown up throughout thousands and thousands of years of human history. So what then in the world is this number doing on the tank containing the mother flame? Well, it could just be a hint from Oda that the mother flame is the key to life and energy, or it could have just been a pride thing where Vegapunk wanted his creation to be super important. Or if we want to cycle back all the way to the Buddhist belief in 108 temptations, this could be a sign that the mother flame will tempt humanity and someone will have to overcome it in order to save the world. But you might be shocked to hear that the letters right below this very special number could hold even more significance for the future of the story. Because here we can see that A and Mu, which at first glance doesn't really seem to mean anything special, after researching some possibilities and looking at this from a Japanese perspective, I think might have some sort of idea what this could actually be hinting at. And let's just start with the most shocking idea, which is that the A and the Mu represent the supermassive lost continent of the old One Piece world, because if you look at legends and myths from our own world, the two most famous mythical lost places that you hear about are Atlantis and the land of Mu. Sometimes these are actually referring to the same place, just referred to by different names, but sometimes there are two different places, one in the Atlantic and one landmass between North America and Asia. The main idea though is that both of these places were a massive continent that was destroyed by some sort of ancient cataclysm and then sunk into the sea. Now, of course, some people will say there's no actual proof of this, though some recent science looking at the Younger Dryas, a period over 12,000 years ago where some truly cataclysmic events seem to have happened on Earth as well, might prove that differently. But whether Atlantis or Mu actually existed in the real world, one way or the other, Oda could have used it as a reference in regard to the Mother Flame. In fact, maybe Vegapunk even believes that the Mother Flame itself is the key to discovering the possible lost continent in the One Piece world. On the other hand, it could also be that Vegapunk is giving a warning that using the Mother Flame could end in the same result as the flood that possibly covered the ancient land. hands. Now, of course, that's all speculation based on real-world inspirations, but there are a few other really interesting ways that we can look at the letters on this tank. First of all, the symbol for ant can be read as to, which does mean ant in Japanese, so if you put that together, you get atomu, or atom. So perhaps this was just his clever way of naming his power station, similar to how we use nuclear power systems in our own worlds. And the other possibility would be that the symbol and is used to represent joining the A and the mu. In other words, possibly bringing two ancient continents or ancient civilizations together, which, yeah, is a bit of a stretch maybe here, but there are just so many cool ideas that could be found in just this one single panel. And speaking of incredible ideas though, perhaps the most obvious reference in this chapter is Vegapunk comparing himself to our own real world's Icarus. Now, in case you don't know, Icarus was the son of a great Greek inventor who was locked away for knowing the secrets of a mythological king. Then, one day, Icarus' father made a pair of wings to escape their prison, which worked out perfectly, but unfortunately, Icarus died because he enjoyed his freedom so much, too much, and in the end flew too close to the sun, his wings melted, and he fell down into his death. And so if Oda is now comparing Vegapunk to Icarus, that means that Vegapunk let himself go too far and was the cause of his own downfall. Which we very clearly can see because his desire to research the Void Century and the lost part of history is part of the reason he was then hunted down by the Gorosei and the world government. And while I think that Joy Boy's origin, Nika, and the Mother Flame were the biggest parts of this chapter, there were actually some other also quite mind-blowing details that we simply must discuss as well. First off, the ancient robot is up and moving around, and it seems like no one can stop it, but what exactly is it going to do? Then we also see Luffy and the Giants running away from St. Warcury, where Luffy still cannot damage the fire-breathing demon boar. Which honestly is a little bit surprising actually, because Luffy was at least able to smack Saturn around a little bit, so does that mean Warcury is just on a whole nother level than Saturn? And on top of that, we actually find out that Vegapunk only recorded this message a few days before the current events in the story, and he actually correctly predicted that there would be a worldwide earthquake. But what we didn't know so far was that this earthquake took place on the same day as everything that is currently happening, which honestly is a little bit strange. Like, why did it take so long after Lulusia was destroyed for this earthquake to happen? I mean, in case you don't know, we're talking like 6 days after Lulusia was destroyed here, so there's definitely something strange going on here. Maybe the earthquake isn't even related to the event? And then of course we also got one of the most heartwarming moments in recent chapters, when for the very first time since the pre-time skip, we actually see a picture of the giant Saul. Ah, my dude's alive. We see him in a forest laughing as he listens to Vegapunk's message, and personally, I'm just so happy to see this guy again. Obviously, we saw him in a dark panel early in Naked Island, but this is actually the first time we see him fully. Clearly, he is doing really well, though in this picture I don't seem to see any scars on him, so maybe he's not the man marked by flames after all. Regardless though, Saul seems to already know what Vegapunk is going to say here, so I just have to imagine that he will play a big role in revealing more ancient lore when we finally reach the Elbaf arc as well, which, because I for one cannot wait to see what happens when Sun God Nika finally shows up on that island. Will they still want to follow their Prince Loki, who might be a bad guy, question mark, or will they decide to follow Luffy as their leader? And what happens if Luffy and Shanks end up fighting? Who will the Giants actually side with if that ever happens? And hopefully we will also learn the true history of what happened with Nika and the Giants, and perhaps the biggest mystery of all, what was Joy Boy's relationship with the Giants and the other allies? Because as we've mentioned, Joy Boy clearly made allies all around the One Piece world and likely had members of all types of races on his crew. I'm talking giants, minks, fishmen, dwarfs, and of course a couple of people from the strongest countries such as Wano. And despite all the mysteries out there, you might be surprised by how much we can actually already predict about those people, that crew. So if you want to know exactly who was on Joy Boy's pirate crew, the very first pirate crew, you can watch this very recent video we made right here that I think fits really well with what happened in this chapter. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I hope to see you in the next one.